Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
On the 7th of December, in the year 43 before Christ, an old man lay in Electica, a Roman-covered wagon. It was on the road to Formiae in central Italy. He was being carried by servants toward the sea. He was 63 years old, he was tired, and he was running out of road. Behind him were soldiers, men sent to kill him, with a warrant signed by a coalition of the three most powerful men in Rome. One of those three had not long before called this old man his friend and teacher. The old man had a ship waiting. He could have been gone already, but he had turned back once, unable to bring himself to leave Italy. And now, the soldiers had caught him. When he heard them coming, he ordered the servants to set the litter down. And then, according to the account that has come down to us across 2,000 years, he did something that tells you everything about who he was. He did not beg. He did not run. He put his head out of the wagon, faced the men who had come to kill him, and offered them his neck. They took it. They cut off his head, and because he had written and spoken against tyranny, they cut off his hands as well. Both were carried back to Rome and nailed to the speaker's platform. He had delivered the speeches that condemned him. The message was not subtle. This is what happens to those who use speech against power. The old man's name was Marcus Tullius Cicero, and the Americans who would, 18 centuries later, build a republic of their own, knew his story by heart. They had translated his speeches as schoolboys. They had read his philosophy as grown men. And when they trembled for the future of their own republic, it was, in part, his road they feared their country may one day walk. To understand what the founders built, we have to understand what they read. And what they read before almost anything else was the wisdom and the warning of Greece and Rome. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 2 of the series Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. Today, the classical inheritance. This episode corresponds to Article 2 of our written series published this past Sunday on our Substack pages. Last week, in the Golden Thread, we established the central claim of this whole series, that the truths the Declaration calls self-evident were not invented in Philadelphia, but inherited, refined across centuries and civilizations. Today, we begin walking that thread at its classical source, in Athens and in Rome. As always, this episode expands upon themes from the article, provides additional primary sources, and addresses complexities that the written format cannot fully explore. Let us begin. Let us go back further still, 3 centuries before Cicero died, to a Greek thinker who did something nobody had quite done before. He decided to study governments the way a naturalist studies animals. His name was Aristotle. Born in 384 BC in northern Greek town of Stagiria, he studied under Plato at the Academy in Athens for 20 years. He tutored a boy who would grow up to become Alexander the Great. And then he founded his own school, the Lyceum. He wrote on nearly everything a human mind could reach in his age: logic, biology, ethics, rhetoric, poetry, the physics of motion, the nature of being itself. And he wrote on politics. Here's the thing to understand about Aristotle's politics. It is not a polished book. It was almost certainly stitched together by his students out of lecture notes And it reads that way: rough in places, repetitive, uneven. And yet, that uneven set of lecture notes became the foundational document of political science as a systemic discipline. And it shaped Western constitutional thinking for 2,000 years. So, what did Aristotle actually contribute? Two things above all. The first was a method. Where his teacher Plato had asked, what is the best imaginable government? A question of pure imagination. Aristotle asked a different and far more fruitful question. He asked, what kinds of governments actually existed? How did they function? Why did they decay? And which arrangements proved stable in practice and which collapsed? He was empirical. He and his students reportedly gathered and examined the constitutions of 158 Greek states. Only one of those studies survived to our own day: the Constitution of the Athenians. And that one we only recovered in the 1800s, written on papyri pulled out of the sands of Egypt. The studies were lost, but the method survived intact. Treat constitutions as objects of empirical study. Look at what actually happens. The habit of mind is one of Aristotle's great gifts to the American founders. The American founders who treated antiquity itself as a laboratory of political experiment. The second contribution was a specific doctrine, and it is the one that shaped American constitutional design more directly than any other classical idea: the doctrine of a mixed constitution. Aristotle began sorting governments. There are, he said, three legitimate forms. These are defined by who rules and whether they rule for the common good. One, rule by one person for the common good is a monarchy. Rule by a few for the common good is an aristocracy. Literally means rule by the best. And rule by the many for the common good, Aristotle called polity, which we usually translate as polity or constitutional government. But each of those three legitimate forms has a shadow, a corrupt twin, in which the rulers govern for themselves instead of for the common good. Monarchy, the rule of one good king, decays into tyranny, the rule of one for himself. Aristocracy, the rule of the virtuous few, decays into oligarchy, the rule of the wealthy few for their own enrichment. And here we have to stop and be a little bit careful, because this is where the ancient vocabulary may trip a modern listener. The corrupt form of rule by the many, the shadow twin of the popular government, Aristotle called democracy. Now that word means something to most Americans it did not mean to Aristotle. When Aristotle says democracy, he does not mean the modern democratic ideal that we cherish. He means something closer to what an American founder would call mob rule or pure democracy, the condition in which a poor majority uses its sheer numbers to plunder the propertied minority, governing for itself rather than for the whole. So when you hear an ancient writer or an 18th century founder warn against democracy, do not hear it as an attack on self-government. Hear it as a warning against the tyranny of the mob, the corruption, not the ideal. And keep that distinction in mind. It will save you from misreading half the political writing of the next 2,000 years. So all six forms, three good, three corrupt, are unstable, each pulling towards its own corruption. What was Aristotle's solution? Mix them. Build a constitution that combines the monarchic element, a single unified executive, the aristocratic element, a deliberative body of experienced and capable men, and the popular element, broad participation by the citizens. Set them in balance so the tendency of each to decay is checked by the others. Such a mixed constitution, Aristotle argued, was empirically more stable, than any pure form. And he added one more piece, which the Americans seized on. The most durable, practical constitution, Aristotle thought, placed an effective power in what he called the middling sort. Those who were neither so rich that they despised the law, nor so poor that they envied everyone who had anything. The man in the middle has a moderate, steadying self-interest. He wants fair institutions because fair institutions are what protect a person like him. A republic anchored in a broad middle class, Aristotle argued, has ballast. You can hear Americans answering him directly. When James Madison wrote Federalist Number 10, his great essay on controlling the violence of faction through a large commercial republic with a substantial middle class, he was writing in recognizably Aristotelian key. And the structure of the federal constitution itself, one president, a senate, a house, is a recognizable adaptation of Aristotle's mixed form. John Adams wrote 3 fat volumes. His defense of constitutions are essentially an extended argument in Aristotelian form. The founders did not just admire Aristotle, they worked with him. But I do owe you the other half of the account because this series does not hide from the failures of its heroes. Aristotle, the man who gave us the analytical tools, was also the author of one of antiquity's most influential defenses of slavery. In his first book of the Politics, he argued that some human beings are slaves by nature, fitted by what he imagined to be their lower rational capacities, to be the living tools of their betters. This was not a careless aside. It is woven throughout the account of the household and of the city. It is the moral rot at the center of his political philosophy. And the founders who barred his analytical brilliance inherited, in the same volume, a sophisticated philosophical defense of an institution they would shortly write into their own republic. The contradiction was already there in the source. Before we leave Greece, one word about the teacher. Because the founders' relationship to Plato is one of the most revealing things about them, and it is almost entirely a story of rejection. Plato's Republic is the most famous political work of antiquity. It imagines an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings in which property is held in common among a guardian class. Families are dissolved in favor of communal child rearing. Art is censored. Religion is manufactured by the state for civic purposes, and the whole order is held together by what Plato openly called noble lies, which are useful falsehoods told to the people by their rulers for their own good. It is a vision of perfect order administered by an enlightened few. The founders read it, and they recoiled. Jefferson, in a letter to Adams in 1814, wrote that he had finally forced himself all the way through the Republic and called it the heaviest task of work he had ever gone through in his life. He had no patience for what he called Plato's whimsies and nonsense, and he could not fathom how such a work had become a classic. Adams was gentler. He granted the literary power of the thing, but on the politics, he agreed with his friend. They saw in Plato the vision of an enlightened few making decisions for the many, the contempt for ordinary life and ordinary judgment, the willingness to fabricate myths in order to keep people in line, and they put it aside. I want you to mark this because it matters far beyond the 18th century. There's a fork in the road here between rule by experts and rule by free citizens under the law. The founders took the road away from Plato, but the 20th and 21st centuries, our faith in the administrative state, in the enlightened expert managing society on behalf of people presumed unable to manage himself, the basket of deplorables, a 2016 presidential candidate once remarked. That is, in a real sense, Plato recovered. The founders saw that road and clearly refused it. The refusal is part of our inheritance, and we will return to it again and again. Now to Rome, and to a Greek who came there in chains. Polybius was born in Greek around the year 200 BC. In 167, after Rome defeated the kingdom of Macedon, he was taken to Rome as a hostage. One of 1,000 Greeks demanded as security for good behavior. But Polybius was no ordinary captive. He landed in the household of one of Rome's leading families, the Scipios, and from that vantage, he watched Roman power at the closest possible range. He was standing with the Roman army outside of Carthage in 146 BC when the city was burned to the ground. It was the same year that Rome crushed his own Greek homeland. Polybius saw empire made. He saw it with his own eyes and from inside the machine. And out of all that watching, he wrote of history of how Rome came to rule the Mediterranean world. 40 books. Most of them lost now. But the 6th book survived. And book 6 is one of the most influential single pieces of political analysis ever written. Because in it, Polybius asked the question every honest observer of politics eventually asked: why do governments decay? His answer was a doctrine he called Anacyclosis, the cycle of constitutions. Let's walk through it, because the founders walked through it, and the fear it planted in them shaped everything they built. It begins with monarchy, one strong leader ruling well in the common interest. The good king earns the loyalty of his people. But monarchy has a fatal flaw: succession. The qualities that made the founder a good ruler do not reliably pass to his son. And so within a generation or two, monarchy curdles into tyranny, the rule of one man for himself against the people he was supposed to serve. The tyrant is eventually overthrown by the best men of the city, who establish aristocracy, rule of the few in the common interest. Having seen what tyranny costs, they govern with moderation. But power compounds across generations. Those founders' virtue erodes in their grandchildren, and aristocracy decays into oligarchy, the rule of the few for themselves. The oligarchs are eventually overthrown by the people, who establish democracy. And here Polybius uses the word in its good sense: broad popular government under law. In its first generation, this is the most attractive of all the constitutions. But it cannot hold. As the founding generation dies off, their descendants come to take freedom and equality for granted. They stop competing for honor and start competing for advantage. Demagogues rise, men who flatter the majority and promise them wealth of the productive. Civic discipline collapses, and democracy rots into its own corrupt twin, which Polybius called ochlocracy, mob rule. And out of the chaos of mob rule, sooner or later, a strong man steps forward, promising order, and the cycle begins again, back at one-man rule. That is Anacyclosis. And here's why it terrified the men who loved the Roman Republic and wanted to build one of their own. It is a wheel. And every form of government is just a station on that wheel, sliding towards the next corruption. But Polybius did not end in despair, and this is his gift. He argued the wheel could be slowed, perhaps even stopped, by the very thing Aristotle had described: a mixed constitution. Rome, he said, had done it. The consuls were Rome's monarchic element, the Senate its aristocratic element, and the popular assemblies were its democratic element. And because each could check the others, Rome had escaped, for a time, the cycle that ground down every pure constitution. The balance was the break. The Americans believed this, truly believed it. The Constitution they wrote is a mixed constitution in exactly the plebeian sense: a president, a senate, a house. each built with the structural means and the structural motive to resist the overreach of the others. And the fear that haunted them, the fear behind the whole elaborate machinery of checks and balances, was Polybius's fear. That a republic which let its institutions decay, which let its power concentrate, would slide down the wheel with mob rule and the strong man waiting at the bottom. And here's where last week's episode pays off. Remember the trunks of books that Jefferson shipped from Paris to Madison in 1786? The histories of the ancient confederacies crossing the Atlantic in crates? Polybius was in those trunks. When Madison sat down to write his notes on ancient and modern confederacies, and later the Federalist essays numbered 18, 19, and 20, he was working with Polybian material, using the Achaean League and the rest of the hard data on how confederacies fell. This was not antiquarian curiosity. For the founding generation, the Polybian cycle was a live and pressing diagnosis of the danger they were trying to escape. This brings us back to the old man on the road to Formiae. Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in 106 before Christ in a country town to a family of respectable rank, but no great family name. He had no inherited path into Rome's highest offices. He rose on one thing, the power of his mind and of his voice. By 63 BC, he had climbed all the way to consul, one of the two highest officials in the Republic. He defended that republic against the conspiracy to overthrow it. He defended it again years later against the dictatorship of Julius Caesar. And after Caesar was assassinated, he defended it one last time against Mark Antony. He lost. And the loss cost him his life. But in his final years, as the political battle was slipping away from him, he wrote the philosophy that gave the Western tradition one of its deepest statements of natural law, the very idea at the heart of this series. 3 of his works reached the founders directly, and we should name them because the founders knew them by name. The first is De Republica, on the Commonwealth. It survives only in fragments, but one of those fragments is among the most important passages in the entire history of political thought. Cicero defines the Commonwealth, the res publica, the public thing, as the property of the people, not a random crowd, but a true community, bound together by shared agreement about what is just and shared devotion to the common good. And in the 3rd book, he sets down the classic statement of natural law. I want to read it to you in full, and I'll do it slowly because nearly everything in this series that we care about is contained in these few lines. There is, in fact, a true law, namely right reason, which is in accordance with nature, applies to all men, and is unchangeable and eternal. By its commands, this law summons men to the performance of their duties. By its prohibitions, it restrains them from doing wrong. We cannot be freed from its obligations by Senate or people, and we need not look outside ourselves for an expounder or interpreter of it. And there will not be different laws at Rome and at Athens, or different laws now and in the future, but one eternal and unchangeable law will be valid for all nations and all times. Consider these words. There is law above the law. It is not made by the Senate, and the Senate cannot unmake it. It is not voted into being, and no vote can repeal it. It is discoverable by reason, the same in every place and every age, binding on Rome and Athens alike, and on us and on every generation that comes after us. When Jefferson, 2,000 years later, opened the Declaration by appealing to the laws of nature and of nature's God, he was writing in a vocabulary Cicero had given the Latin language. The thread runs straight from this fragment to Philadelphia. And Cicero's second work is De Legibus, on the laws. Here, Cicero presses the argument into the realm of civic legislation. A law's authority, he argues, does not come from the power of the men who pass it. It comes from the law's conformity to the higher law of nature. And from this follows a radical conclusion. A statute that contradicts natural justice is not merely a bad law. It is, properly speaking, not a law at all. This idea travels from Cicero to Aquinas in the Middle Ages to Sir Edward Coke on the English bench, through Coke to the American tradition of judicial review. The notion that there is a higher standard against which even the acts of a legislature can be measured and found wanting. His third work, De Officiis, on duties, and this is the one that colonial Americans actually read most. It's not the lofty abstraction. It is a practical handbook of the duties a decent man owes to his family, his city, and his fellow citizens. It taught the 18th century gentleman the Roman civic virtues: honor, good faith, seriousness, courage. The cluster of qualities the American founding generation expected of a Republican citizen. And it contained Cicero's teaching on property. That while nature assigns no man a particular field or coin, once property has been justly acquired and long held, it becomes something that the Commonwealth exists in large part to protect. From this one book, the founders drew both their doctrine of civic virtue and their doctrine of property rights. Both are part of the inheritance. So what, in sum, did Cicero give the American tradition? 4 propositions. That there is a law above all human law, discoverable by reason, binding on everyone everywhere. That a political community is held together by shared moral agreement, not by mere force. That the best political order mixes the one, the few, and the many under higher law. And that the citizen owes the Commonwealth duties of virtue that no statute can command, but every formed conscience can recognize. These 4 propositions run straight into the Declaration, the Federalist, the Constitution, and the whole moral vocabulary of American self-government. Cicero was no saint, and this series will not pretend otherwise. He owned slaves, though he freed his secretary Tiro, a man he plainly loved and wrote letters of real affection. He played the hard game of late Republican politics with the ambitions and the compromises of a Roman in his class. What he was a careful thinker who put into durable words the central claims of the natural law tradition, and a man who, in the end, paid for those convictions with his life. So let us go back to the road one more time and finish the story we started. Over the 15 months before his death, Cicero had delivered a series of blistering speeches against Mark Antony. The Philippics, he called them, after the orations of the great Demosthenes once hurled at Philip of Macedon. They were a triumph of moral courage and of rhetorical art. They were also a catastrophic political miscalculation. Because when Antony joined with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and a third man, Lepidus, to form what we call the Second Triumvirate, the 3 of them did what frightened men with armies do. They drew up lists, prescription lists, the names of their enemies to be hunted down and killed. Cicero's name was on that list, and Octavian, who had once called Cicero his friend and mentor, let it stand. You know the rest now. The flight to the coast, the turning back, the soldiers on the road, the wagon set down, the old man offering his neck. And then the final cruelty, the head and the hands carried back to Rome and nailed to the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, so that everyone who passed would see what became of a man who spoke against power. One source even tells us that Antony's wife took Cicero's severed head into her lap and drove hairpins through the tongue that had spoken the Philippics. The Republic did not outlive him by long. Within 15 years, Octavian had made himself Augustus, sole ruler of Rome. And the Senate? The Senate became a chamber of ceremony. The outward forms of the Republic lasted for centuries, but the substance was dead on that road. The Americans understood this story in their bones. They knew what the prescriptions list meant. They knew that a republic does not usually die in one dramatic blow. It dies in a long slide of compromises and accommodations and emergencies until one day the men who still believed in the old order find themselves on a road at 63 with soldiers coming over the hill and no republic left to escape to. Their dread of standing armies, of executive power consolidating, of political enemies destroyed through legal forms, all of it had a texture, a shadow of Cicero. They had translated the Philippics as boys. They knew exactly where republics could end, and this is the cautionary half of the classical inheritance, and it is every bit as important as the wisdom. I've been telling you that the founders read these men, and I want to make that concrete because it's easy to say that the founders were influenced by the classics and let that phrase go soft. It was not soft. It was specific. It was operational. The education of the American gentleman in the 18th century was at its core a classical education. A boy bound for college started Latin at 7 or 8 and added Greek by 12. He read Cicero's orations, Caesar's commentaries, Virgil, Horace, and in the better schools, Aristotle and Plato in the original Greek. To get into Harvard or Yale or William and Mary or Princeton or King's College in New York, you had to be examined in Latin composition and Greek translation. The classics were not enrichment. They were basic curriculum. And the engagement did not stop at school. John Adams' own copy of Cicero, preserved today in Boston, is crammed with his handwritten notes. Adams arguing with the text in the margins, copying long passages into his diaries, reading and rereading across his whole life. His political prose deliberately carries the rhythm of Cicero's oratory. Madison's preparation for the Constitutional Convention leaned most heavily on the classical histories. He treated the Amphictyotic Council and the Achaean League and the Lycian Confederacies as analyst case studies in how confederacies succeed and fail. Jefferson read Greek and Latin freely his entire life and kept Tacitus and Thucydides on his desk at Monticello. And young Alexander Hamilton carried Plutarch's Lives into winter camp at Valley Forge, reading the lives of Alexander and Pericles and Cato and Caesar as working education in statecraft. Even the disguises they wrote under were classical. When the Constitution was defended, it was defended by Publius, a Roman name. When it was attacked by men writing as Brutus and Cato, Roman names. To sign a political essay with a Roman name in 1788 was to announce to your readers that the argument belonged to a conversation that had begun in the ancient world, and that everyone in the room was expected to know it. That is what it meant to call the classical inheritance operational. The founders did not gesture vaguely at Greece and Rome. They knew the material cold, and they used it with discipline. But an honest history owes its hardest critics a fair hearing at full strength. So before I answer them, I'm going to put two serious challenges to the classical inheritance as forcefully as I can. The first challenge, I believe, is the stronger one, and it concerns the moral failures of the ancients themselves. Aristotle defended natural slavery. Cicero owned human beings. Plato dreamed of an authoritarian city run by a chosen few. The Greek and Roman republics, whose virtue the 18th century so admired, excluded the great majority of the people who lived in them. Slaves, foreigners, the poor, women. It excluded them from any real political life. And so the critic says to draw the foundations of universal liberty from sources this deeply soaked in slavery is either incoherent or simply dishonest. The Americans who borrowed Cicero borrowed a slaveholder, and the republic they built carried the same hideous compromise from its very first day. The second challenge comes from serious scholars, the historians J.G.A. Pocock and Bernard Bailyn. They argue that the tradition the founders actually drew on was not the modern liberal tradition of individual natural rights at all, but the classical republican tradition, civic virtue, public spiritedness, and the citizen sacrificing his private interest for the common good. On this reading, to put Locke at the Declaration's universal language of rights at the center of its founding is kind of an anachronism. The founders, the argument goes, were really Republicans, not liberals. Now, both of these deserve a real answer, so let me give it. To the first, the moral failures. The honest answer is to simply concede the facts and then refuse the conclusion. Yes, the classical authors held views we now rightly reject. Views that ought to have been rejected then, and a few minds in antiquity actually did begin to reject them. The founders inherited that contradiction, and their own republic was born with the wounds of slavery already inside it, written into its compromise and visible to anyone who cared to look. Some of them saw it plainly. Jefferson, whose own conduct on this question was tortured and contradictory his whole life, wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever. Adams, who never owned a human in his entire life, thought slavery a moral poison. They knew they were carrying forward both the achievement and the failure. But here's the crucial point. The philosophical achievements do not depend on the moral failures. The claim that there is a law above human law, the analysis of mixed constitution, the diagnosis of how republics decay, the argument that civil law draws its authority from natural justice, these stand or fall on their own reasoning, not on the private conduct of the men who first spoke them. A true thing said by a flawed man is still a true thing. We name the failures honestly. We carry the wisdom forward anyway. This series will not absolve the failures, not in the least, but it will also not throw away the wisdom because these men who found it were, like all men, fallible. The second challenge. Were they Republicans or liberals? And I'm speaking little r Republicans and little l liberals. The answer is that question sets up is a false choice. They were both. The scholars are right that the classical Republican virtue ran powerfully through 18th century American thought. The founders genuinely prized civic participation and public spirit, and they got them from the very authors we have met today. But the correction has been pushed too far. Republican virtue and natural rights are not enemies. They're not at odds. They are two parts of one project. And the proof stands right in front of us. His name is Cicero. Cicero is both the philosopher of natural law, whose words echo in the Declaration, and the philosopher of civic virtue, whose duties shaped the Republican citizen. The founders read him as both at once and saw no contradiction. Because there is none. This series will follow them and treat the classical inheritance and the natural rights tradition as what they are, a single strand of the golden thread. So let us bring the episode down to our takeaways. The ancients gave the founders a set of instruments, and those instruments still work. Aristotle's question, what actually happens to this kind of government in practice? Polybius's wheel, which way is this constitution sliding, towards balance or toward corruption? Cicero's standard, is this human law in line with a higher law or against it? Hold up our moment against those instruments. Ask Aristotle's question about effective power. Where does it actually sit today? And is the broad middle class that he thought gave a republic its ballast being reinforced or hollowed out? Ask Polybius' question, which station on the wheel are we nearest? Sober self-government under law, or the flattery of the mob and the longing for a strong man to fix everything? Ask Cicero's question of any statute you like. Does it answer to a law above itself, or does it claim that the vote of a senate or the will of a majority can make right out of wrong? And notice, and this is the heart of it, that Cicero's standard is the natural law root of the very tool we built this series around. When the liberty test asks whether a group can delegate to government a power no individual ever had, it is asking Cicero's question in plainer clothes. There is law above the law. The Senate did not make it, and the Senate cannot repeal it. Fancy hat and larger mobs do not change it. Cicero said that 2,000 years before we did, and he said it standing on the path of men who would kill him for it. That is the inheritance. Not a museum piece, a set of working tools, and the example of men willing to use them when it cost everything. We began on a road in Italy, with an old man offering his neck to the soldiers. Let me end where the article ended, because I can think of no better image for what this whole series is about. 2,000 years separate Cicero on the road to Formiae from James Madison at his desk in Montpelier reading Polybius by candlelight in the spring of 1786, getting ready to build a republic. Think about that candle. It is still burning. The books Madison read, you can still read. The arguments the ancients made are still arguments any thinking citizen can pick up and engage today in a country with a library and the freedom to use it. That is the hope inside the gravity of this episode. Yes, the ancients failed in terrible ways, and we have named those failures honestly. Yes, Cicero's road is a warning about how republics die, and we should take that warning seriously. But the wisdom outlived the failures, and it outlived the men, and outlived even the republic that fell. It crossed an ocean in a trunk of books that helped build something new. That is what an inheritance is. It is handed forward, hand to hand, and it lives only as long as someone is willing to read. Next Saturday, in episode 3, Athens, Jerusalem, and the House of Wisdom, the thread widens beyond Greece and Rome. We turn to the Hebrew covenant tradition and its radical claim that even the king stands under the law. And then to the astonishing story of how, when Aristotle had all but vanished from the Christian West, it was scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba, in the House of Wisdom and the libraries of Islamic Spain, who preserved the Greek inheritance and handed it back. The golden thread, it turns out, runs through more civilizations than the schoolbooks usually admit. And this coming Tuesday in our contemporary application episode, what the classics teach about democracy. We take Aristotle's and Polybius' warnings about the corruption of popular government and we hold them up against our own politics. Then we ask what the ancient distinction between a republic and a pure democracy still has to teach a citizen in our own moment. Do we still have the vox populi, the voice of the people, within our legislative process? I am Jeff Gellick, and this has been episode 2 of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, Empire of Liberty, Politics and Systems. And subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. Like the episodes, comment, share, all of that helps this project. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.